Welcome, everybody. We're going to get started. Please have a seat. Hello, hello,
Okay, I've got 7:03. I think it's starting time. So I am so delighted to see everybody here. And I hope you are all delighted to be back together in person. The first of many, I hope, events that we'll all be able to gather together in person. Welcome. Thanks for being here tonight. On behalf of our clergy team and our adult ed committee, I welcome you to our TRS 60th anniversary Summer Limmud series, Choosing an Ethical Life. Each week, one member of our clergy team has been presenting on a different aspect of a Jewish approach to ethics. We know that you'll find tonight's presentation engaging. Our newest rabbi, Alexandra Stein, will present tonight on the ethics of systematic justice work. I know this is not all about me, but this is my first opportunity to welcome Rabbi Stein in person. And for those of you who are also here to meet her for the first time, isn't it great that she's here? And for those of you who have already had that pleasure, we are so delighted that you are here. And we're looking forward to this and to everything else you're going to bring us. So we will benefit, and we're greatly blessed to have you here. Thank you. So we encourage your participation during this presentation. Just be sure to speak into the microphone. Since this series, the microphone that I assume will be circulating, Alan, being held right back there, be sure to speak into it because the series is being recorded for future access by members. And now it is my great pleasure to present Rabbi Stein.
Thank you all so much. It's really a delight to be here. Thank you for inviting me to be part of this ethics series. And also, I will just say, I'm having like a really, really wonderful time at TRS. I'm loving meeting people. I'm just feeling so welcomed. So thank you all for that. I feel delighted to be able to work with the clergy team and all the staff here. I feel delighted to be able to be with all of the lay leaders I've met so far. And if we haven't met, I think I made my way through maybe like 40% of the crowd tonight before we started. I didn't mean to leave you out, and I would love to meet you. And thanks for studying. So what we're going to be talking about tonight is some of the ethics of systematic justice work. This is a really big topic. And so I brought, you may have noticed if you glance through the source sheets, I brought us texts that get at some of the things that might come up when we think about ethics related to systemic justice work. By no means all of the questions we might ask or all of the avenues we might want to explore. So I'm hoping that we'll get an inroad into some places that we might find interesting and fruitful, and that if there are areas that come up that we haven't touched on, that we could another time. So to lay out some terms, I'm thinking about systematic justice work or systemic justice work as any work to change a system, whether it is a government or some other type of system, to make the world a more ethical place. And what I'd like to invite us to think about tonight is a question that I think a lot of Jewish thinkers have asked over time, which is, as we do that work, if we believe that the world needs to be transformed in X, Y, or Z way to be a more just and ethical place, how should we act along the way? And how should we address challenges that might arise as we try to do work that we know extends beyond our power as individuals and also probably beyond our lifetimes? And how should we conceptualize that? And so that's kind of the broad introduction to this. The other thing that I think is worth acknowledging is that Jewish justice thought, I think there's a really rich legacy throughout Jewish history of thinking a lot about our responsibility to other people, what we owe other people in terms of food and shelter and health and sort of mutual responsibility. And there's been some interesting scholarship about the way that modernity changed a lot of things, including in the Jewish community, about how people saw themselves as agents in the world, and the way the concept of citizenship had changed the way many people saw the domain of their work. So that we might have an idea in modernity that we can change our whole society, that some of these texts that are from other times and places, the person may not have had the same idea that an individual change agent working with another group of individuals at any socioeconomic level could effectuate systemic change. And so I think it's worth sort of acknowledging that, but then sort of thinking about what we can pull forward from these. So there are kind of two parts to this. One is this source sheet. One is an exploration of some of the ways that people have reacted to the quote, "Tzedek, tzedek tirdof," justice, justice shall you pursue, which comes from Deuteronomy. The other, and we'll get to that first, the other is kind of an extended exploration, mostly through stories rather than direct commentary, of the question, what does it mean to believe that it's not up to us to do everything? It's not up to us to finish all the work we're doing, but we also can't give up on it. And so how should we address that question practically speaking? What are some of the pitfalls we might run into? What are some of the dangers? So that is the roadmap of where we're going. And before we sort of launch into these texts, I wanted to invite just some general thoughts. If we were to think broadly that systems of ethics usually arise to answer questions of challenges we're facing or moments when our values might be in conflict with each other, I wanted to ask, as you think of systematic justice work that matters to you or that you're aware of, what do you think some of those challenges are, either that you've encountered or that you've read or heard about in the world? Maybe a values conflict challenge, maybe a challenge of living up to values. What are some of the things we should be thinking about when we think about the domain of ethics of systematic justice work? Yes, please go ahead, Larry.
Social cohesion.
Oh, great. Okay.
Social cohesion during crisis.
Great. So, social cohesion in crisis. Okay.
Actually, if she's writing it out of word,
Please,
you
go.
can just yell it out.
Yeah, go for it. I think
Common knowledge base.
common knowledge base, and I'll take one more. Go ahead.
And who defines values?
Okay. Common knowledge base. Who defines values? Does anyone else have one they want to add? Yes, please go ahead.
Perseverance.
Absolutely. And a lot of our texts are going to look at perseverance and also the question of hope. Is hope necessary to persevere or not? What does hope mean? How do we think about that? What do we need hope for, if we need hope for anything? Does anybody else want to add anything that's coming to mind right now? Yes, Larry, go ahead.
Agreed upon values that seem to conflict on a particular issue.
Great. So I'm going to draw an arrow from who defines values, and I'm going to say, what if agreed upon values conflict? Okay. I think this is a great list. Yes, please, Sam and then Carol. Go ahead.
What pops to my mind is a tension between values and power.
Great.
And sort of how they play out in deciding what to do.
Okay. And just to ask a little follow-up with that, is the question figuring out what you have the power to do in terms of your values, or is it a different values versus power tension?
And how do you, it's the cohesion to values in the face of the allure of power. Or with the ability to act. So you may know what values are, but then I think we see that every day, the interaction of your own power, agency, and values that might speak out differently.
Absolutely, thank you. Carol, yes, go ahead.
Yeah, what does it mean to treat people equally, based on gender, on income, or whatever beliefs they have, whatever it might be?
Yeah, thank you. That is certainly something we've been talking about a lot lately, to treat people equally. Yes, please, go ahead.
I'm just thinking like integrity, because it's all voluntary, it's not law.
Absolutely. Integrity. And we'll take one more in the very, or two more in the very back. Go ahead.
I'm just going to add equitable versus equal.
Or equitably. Okay. And yes, please go ahead.
Just thinking about the discussion that Rabbi Sachs led 2 weeks ago on speech, and just do we need to be reminded to, or how often do we need to be reminded to kind of, while we're fighting for the things that we believe in, keep things above the fray?
Absolutely. Speech reminders. Okay, great. And I think, was there one more? Okay, no. Great, excellent. I think this is a wonderful list, and if you think of more that we want to add to it later, we absolutely can. But a great place to get started. So, what I'd like to invite us to do first is we're going to look at the responses, which you'll see come from different times and places, to Deuteronomy 16:20. I'm going to move through them kind of quickly, just to offer some context, probably too quickly, and then I'm going to invite some small group discussion about them, which I'll prompt a little more closely when we're at that time, and then we can come back together. So, the text in the Torah says, "Justice, justice shall you pursue, that you may thrive and occupy the land that Adonai your God is giving you." This comes in a Torah portion that is all about how the Israelites should act once they get into the land of Israel. It has a strong focus on anti-corruption. It has a lot about sort of judges shouldn't be corrupt, and it also has a lot about if you have to have a king, here's how the king should act, and here are some things that the king should try to avoid. It also has things that we wouldn't necessarily associate with justice, like it has a long discussion of idol worship and how to avoid that. And there are some interesting commentaries on the idea that if idol worship is worshiping like an object, worshiping something that's not God, to the point that you'd sacrifice other things for it, how might or might not that also fit into this discourse? But as you'll see in the commentaries, some people interpret justice, justice shall you pursue, tzedek, tzedek tirdof, in relation to the 2 lines in Deuteronomy that come before it, which are specifically about the behavior of judges in trials. So there are going to be some of our commentaries that see it as pretty exclusive to the judicial sphere that this is coming in. Other commentaries are going to see this as a maxim for life much more broadly. They're also, and I think both are very legitimate readings of the verse in its context. They just sort of are taking different angles at it. They'll also define justice really differently. Most of these commentaries hinge on the repetition of the word justice. And we might think, based on the way repetition functions in English, and honestly probably also the way it functioned for the people who wrote the Bible, we might think that the word justice is repeated to say that it's important, and this is a done deal, and that's the whole thing. Justice is important, go pursue it. Most of our commentators are going to instead use a midrashic technique called lashon yetera, which means excess language, that posits that if there's a word in the Torah that doesn't need to be there, if it's an extra word, it's there for a reason and it's there to teach us something. I think that, to me at least, it's helpful to think about lashon yetera as a poetic device, because I think when we try to apply rules of logic as we understand them to it, it doesn't make so much sense, because again, we might go back to, this just looks like emphasis. Why are we But if we think about it as people in different times and places who are engaging deeply with Torah, using it as an opportunity to say, hey, I think there are two types of this thing. In this case, a lot of these commentators are going to say, hey, I think there are at least two different types of justice that we need to be aware of. And they're doing it not because they don't understand that maybe this is emphasis, but because it's sort of a poetic way to say, let's look more deeply at this, let's complicate this a little bit. So this is the basis to which they'll respond. Some of them are also going to be responding to the very provocative idea that without justice, the Israelites are not going to be able to live in the land. Many more commentaries that are on these pages do respond to that idea, and they really struggle with it because they ask, what about people who lose their national autonomy, who were acting justly? How should we see those people's lives? That's less a focus here, but we could certainly talk about that. Before we get into what the commentaries say, if I could just take a couple of thoughts, what do you think are potentially different types of justice that we should be aware of? If we were kind of rolling with this idea, this Lashon Yetera idea of pursuing at least two different types of justice at the same time, not just one, what would you put on the table? Does anybody have anything that they'd want to add right away? And if not, we can come back to it. Don't worry, no pressure. Yes, go ahead.
Just seeing like resources, like the basics, justice that we all have resources.
Absolutely, thank you. And actually one of our commentaries is going to get pretty close to naming that as one of the types, so it's a good preview, thank you. So resources might be one type of justice we'd want to pursue. All right, let's come back to this. What I'm going to invite us to do, yes, please go ahead.
Equal opportunity. So it's a big issue right now in
Yeah, you're good.
big issue right now in higher education.
Mm-hmm.
Is it just to take people purely on merit exams, or is it just to have a diversity? And people argue eloquently for both points of view, and it's that kind of conflict.
Thank you so much. And I think that's actually also, both of these are really helpful previews of ideas that we're going to see here. So I think maybe let's dive in. This goes in chronological rather than thematic order. I apologize if that's not the most helpful for keeping it straight in your mind, but I think the chronology is interesting in its own way. So our first text is from the Babylonian Talmud, which we think was composed sometime between the years 400 and 600 CE. Some of the Babylonian Talmud incorporates texts that are much older. Some incorporates texts that are kind of pretending to be much older by using old language. This could be either one of these. It's in Hebrew, and sometimes Hebrew in the Talmud means that it's a genuinely ancient text. Sometimes it's like if one of us were trying to write something that was in the language we think Abraham Lincoln might have used. It's like a 50-50 toss-up, what they're doing here. But they're sort of exploring this, and they say, one mention of justice refers to judgment. The word they use in Hebrew is din. And one mention of justice refers to compromise. How so? When two boats meet each other in the river, if they both try to pass at the same time, they both sink. But if one passes after the other, they both stay afloat. And then it goes on to give an example about two camels passing on a narrow hill, same idea, they're going to fall down the hill. And then it gets into, well, how would you decide which boat would go first? And it sort of throws some ideas out. Maybe one has more cargo, maybe one has a more urgent sort of need to get to its destination. If they're both kind of the same level of need, they still need to figure it out between them. So the Babylonian Talmud is inviting us to think about, are there moments when, how do we discern what a moment is when we need to compromise? How do we figure out when we are the ships in the river? Because rarely are we actually the ships in the river or the camel on the hills. Like, it's rarely that clear to us. But how do we figure out when we're not in a moment to sort of push forward with whatever we think the right thing is, but to work with people in a more compromise-oriented way? So that's one question there opening. A different take from Ibn Ezra, and he probably wrote this in the 12th century, is he says this could mean at least three things. The first is that one should pursue justice whether one gains or loses. So whatever you should be acting for justice, whether the first justice is the justice where like you're going to come out on top, the second justice is the justice where it's not going to go so well for you, but you should be working for justice no matter what. He then says, or maybe it's that you should pursue justice as long as you're alive. It's more about time, is his second theory. And his third theory, which might, I think is very modern, or maybe the word is repeated for emphasis. Maybe it's coming twice just because it's important, he adds last. A little bit later, Maimonides, in an introduction to the Mishnah, so an introduction to the book that preceded the Talmud, and he's sort of contextualizing to his readers, why should we care about what this says? And specifically, what should we learn from the style of the Mishnah, which is that partially, not fully, the Mishnah is often very apodictic, but like the parts of the Mishnah that record arguments between different rabbis and sort of either do or don't try to resolve them. What should we learn from the fact that this is part of the Mishnah, he's asking. And he's going to rely on a version of justice that means something kind of similar to truth. And these are also a strain of our commentaries that I didn't put in that many of them, but there's a strain of Jewish thought that says that justice and truth are the same idea. And he may not be exactly saying that, but I think the fact that he's thinking about truth is useful to know when we encounter what he says. So he says, when the ancient rabbis, who were honorable, pious, and magnanimous scholars, outstanding in their wisdom, basically way cooler than us, saw that the words of one who's in disagreement with them were better than their words, they conceded to them and recanted to that one's opinion. All the more so when other people, us lowly schmucks who are not like them, see that the truth is leaning towards the one with which they have a conflict, should such a one lean towards the truth and not stiffen their neck? And this is the meaning of justice, justice shall you pursue. So he's sort of taking us maybe in the direction of this concept of compromise, but not with an orientation towards getting past each other in the river, with an orientation towards you should be willing to know when you're wrong, and that this is part of pursuing justice. Our next person, Bahia Ben Asher, who we're moving forward in time again a little more, he's maybe half a century after Maimonides. He says that it means you should be righteous in both word and deed, which I think is a nice throwback to Rabbi Sachs's class, amongst other things, that they need to match each other. The next commentary, which I apologize, the first line is on page 1 and then it flips, it's a little squished. But this is from the 1600s, and Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz says that there are two forms of justice. One refers to Torah law, and the other refers to a legal category, which is actually also a legal category in modern Israeli law, although, of course, he doesn't know that. But a provision called Hora'at Sha'ah, a temporary provision responding to a time-bounded circumstance, usually an emergency. So in modern Israeli law, a lot of sort of coronavirus-related legislation is put into this category. It's responding to a temporary circumstance. But then Isaiah Horowitz says, following a rabbinic tradition, concerning the latter situation, i.e. that you sometimes need to follow not what the Torah says is the best idea, but something that you know is the best response to a contingency, the Torah continues, in order that you may live and inherit the land that Adonai your God is about to give you. And then Isaiah Horowitz adds, for Jerusalem was destroyed only because the authorities insisted on basing all of their judicial verdicts on Torah law. So only because people were being too rigid is his interpretation. He's participating in a long tradition of sort of Israelite self-blame for the destruction of Jerusalem by invasion, which we might or might not agree with, but he's saying a society will crumble if you're too rigid about what your laws are, and these are what the two justices mean. Our next person, Moshe Avigdor Amiel, who was the head rabbi of Tel Aviv, he says, justice refers to the means and the ends. So it can't just be that the end result is going to be just. The way you try to go about it also has to be just. So I'm going to pause for a moment. Our last two thinkers are more modern. So Jonathan Sachs says that it's not just about the rule of law, that one justice might be the rule of law, but the other is about equal distribution of resources. And that if you have a society that's following laws rigidly, but there's a huge inequality of access to resources, that you're not, in fact, pursuing justice adequately. And then our last person, Rabbi Jen Gubitz, says maybe this is about loud justice that other people can see, loud justice work that people can see, and quiet justice work, behind the scenes work. And maybe we need to lift up both of those. So these are a lot of different things, and I apologize for running through them quickly and sort of at you. What I'd like to invite in a moment is I'm going to invite you to chat with someone or a few people near you about the following questions. One, are there any of these that jump out at you as really resonant? Like you appreciate what the person says, you think that this is a good maxim in life? Two, are there any that jump out at you as strange or confusing or discordant, or you're not confused, you just disagree, and here's why? You know, are there any that don't sit well with you? And three, is there anything that you would add as you think about sort of considerations? So those are, I'm going to ask you in a moment to chat with somebody near you about that, but before we do, does anybody have any initial questions or gut reactions that you think would be helpful to the room to hear before we break up for a moment?
The latter part got to it, and just listening to this, it did occur to me the difference between process and content. Mm-hmm. For the lawyers in the room, rule of law usually is viewed as what justice is, so that the system works, that everybody is treated. But it occurs to me that the real issue here is the substance of it. Mm-hmm. It's, and then you get to the no-hide laws later change. So the substance is, in fact, Torah, if you will, or the version or the vision of a Jewish / therefore just, mm-hmm. as opposed to maybe a Buddhist or a Hindi or a. So there has to be the broader agreement on the substance, and I don't know that we get to this yet. In other words, it's what is right and wrong, and we sort of assuming that it occurs. This is great stuff.
No, I really appreciate your question, and I would offer, although I could be wrong, but I would offer a thought that I'm curious how it lands. I don't know that everyone here agrees about what is right and wrong. I think they're writing across much too long a span of time and space to be on the same page about that. And I'm also not sure. So I think that they're taking slightly different positions, many of these thinkers, on what you just said about whether sort of either truth or law is, and which law is the core of justice. I think some of them are right there with you. And others, like perhaps those advocating for compromise, might be articulating something a little bit different or might not. And I think that's one of the things I'm curious about. Is sort of like, is there a plurality of visions about how similar justice and law are on this page or in our lives? Are there not? And how does that sit with folks? But thank you for raising that. That's, I think, very, very helpful. Does anybody else have any comments or questions that you think would be helpful for the group to hear before we chat a little? Please go ahead.
I'm not sure it's helpful. But it is, thank you. I've heard it said, I'm not sure this is true, that in Judaism, the concept of justice is what is fair to all parties. Mm-hmm. But in some other thought, like, I don't want to characterize it, but some Christian thought, justice is giving the underdog an advantage because they have less to work with. So it's more just to not be fair to everybody in the current time because there's uneven odds.
So thank you for raising that. I want to say also, I think that gives us a great opportunity to look quickly again at the Rabbi Jonathan Sachs quote, which is on page 2. It's the second to last one on page 2. So what I think is interesting is that Larry, he's responding to kind of exactly the idea you just said, which I think we can find there are verses in the Torah that say vis-a-vis the actions of judges that you shouldn't give anybody preference in judgment, your judgment as a judge, whether they are rich or poor is the explicit thing that's stated. So like judge everyone fairly, don't throw in with a rich person, don't let yourself be bribed, and also don't throw in with somebody who you understand to be very economically marginalized in your society, if in fact they transgressed the law. And I think that is a core idea in Jewish thought. And what I think is interesting about what Rabbi Sachs is saying is, so he's referencing that idea. He says, and he's acknowledging elsewhere in this essay, which, sorry, this is a tiny excerpt from it, but it's a good, if you Googled tzedakah, the untranslatable virtue, you can find it pretty quickly. It's a lovely short essay he wrote. He thinks about the idea of mishpat, meaning law or justice, and he says, this is one thing that's important. But in Judaism, another thing that's important, as he says, is that people have access to resources and that they're widely distributed. And that for him, this is what the idea of tzedakah means. And the part I cut with the ... He says he thinks that tzedakah is untranslatable in English because it means both charity and justice. And in English and also in Latin, those are thought of as antithetical values. But that he views tzedakah, charity/justice, encompassing both, as the important counterpoint of mishpat, law, and that we need to have an approach that incorporates both. And that if we're living in a society with radical, I'm going to say based on what he wrote, maybe inequality or perhaps inequity, although I'm not sure what framing he would have used. But if we're living in a world with radical inequality and we're following the mishpat, the law to the letter, we've gone astray somehow, is I think what he is positing. And I think there are other thinkers on this list and elsewhere and in Jewish thought who would push back and say, no, actually, that's not. So I think that dialogue is very alive here, and thank you for pulling it forward. Please go ahead.
I would like you to remove the stumbling block in front of this slide first and second.
Please.
Okay, here's my question.
Yeah.
Is this, I'm not sure that I understand whether this is implying or assuming that there is an objective definition of justice. Mm-hmm. Or whether justice is subjective, and if it is, how are we coming to the table in our subjective ways? And if there is an objective definition of justice, what is it?
That's really helpful. Thank you. I would say I think that what justice has meant in Jewish thought has changed over time, that I think there are some core values that we can definitely derive as important Jewish values, like the idea that, right, the Torah commandment, there shall be no needy, and sort of then the follow-up commandment that there will always be needy, but you should care for the needy. So there's this sense of a dialectic there, or a tension between our ideal and the actual, but that in an ideal world, we would push for a world where people had equal access to resources, the idea of welcoming the stranger, the idea of pursuing truth. I think a lot of Jewish thought has a very strong affinity with the idea of truth. I think that we're living in maybe a more complicated time period than some of these folks around your question, because I think there's less agreement about what is sort of like a source that we believe is objectively true that tells us what is right and wrong. And I think for a lot of these folks, Torah is just true and it comes from God. And we might push back a little bit and say, well, yes, but you thought that Torah was true in a very particular way to your time period, that, you know, people in another time period didn't see it that way. But I think the question you're asking, I'll maybe leave in the air, but I'm delighted if people want to throw out ideas about it. I think it is the question at the heart of this, and I would argue a genuine tension in sort of Jewish thought over thousands of years. I think others might argue, no, there is a justice that Judaism says exists in the world. And if you are one of those others, please feel free to say so, and we can bring that into our conversation. But thank you. Please go ahead.
Yeah, based on the discussion we've had thus far, I would just caution against conflating justice with law. Particularly when we're referring to civil law as opposed to religious law, because that's developed through a dynamic of various power interests, and does not necessarily reflect any absolute term that we would apply to justice.
Thank you. I really appreciate that. I will throw out that I think some of these people do think justice and law are the same thing. So if we hear that in this conversation, I think we're hearing some of them correctly, and that's a really important voice sort of pushing back against that idea. Yes, please.
I would just also add that a lot of, it's Rabbi Sachs being the exception here, but a lot of the older scholars that you reference are referring to Jewish law.
Yes, I think a lot of them are. So I think that where you start deviating from that is in the 1600s. So I think Rabbi Isaiah Horowitz is the first person who's really grappling with moments where Jewish law is not going to win the day all of the time. Although but I think absolutely. Thank you. Okay, yes, please.
Hi, finally getting my chance to speak. When I look at this very complicated issue, what I'm seeing is that we, Homo sapiens, are taking a journey. And the reason we can't agree on whether justice is subjective or objective is that it is subjective. We have not agreed what is right for everyone. And that is the source of all the conflict around the world. What is right for everyone? Until we start understanding and are in agreement that this is fair. It took us a civil war to get rid of slavery, but even up until the civil rights actions of the 60s, we still hadn't agreed that people of African descent were equal. And some people still today. The same thing with anti-Semitism, the same thing with actions against people of different ethnicities or different income groups. We have not agreed, and until everyone agrees, we'll not get there. But we're on the march.
Thank you so
much. We're
much.
heading there.
Thank you so much. I think that's a wonderful moment for us to pause, and I'm going to invite everyone to chat with a neighbor or a few neighbors, and just to boil it down a little from what I said before for time, let's maybe say, is there anything that sticks out to you as really resonant? Or is there anything that sticks out to you as like, you think this is pretty mashugana, but it's interesting that someone thought it once? And if so, what? And then we'll maybe hear a couple voices from that. But please go ahead for a moment or two. Okay, I've been asked to repeat the question one more time, so I will quickly. The question is, of these, I believe 8, maybe 9 thinkers, is there any one of these quotes that is really resonant for you? You agree with this idea that both of these types of justice are important? Or is there anyone that you really disagree with, or it raises lots of questions for you, or however you want to frame it? How do these ideas sit with you? Please go ahead. Okay, I'll invite you to take maybe one more minute on your conversations, with apologies for cutting off what seemed like very rich conversations, but please go ahead, take like one more minute. What? It's a good thing. Okay, I'll invite everyone to pause your conversations. I so apologize for cutting you off. I also invite you to continue them after the class. But I'll ask as we come back together, just if a couple people want to share what stood out to your group or to you as an individual. Was there anything that really resonated or really didn't? Were there any points of strong agreement or strong disagreement in your group? Would anyone like to share back from the... Yes. Please go ahead.
We disagreed strongly with Rabbi Sachs.
All right, great. Tell us more. How come?
The United States, and perhaps England too, are capitalistic, and the rich are getting richer, the poor are getting poorer, the middle class is shrinking or maybe stagnant, and there's a great diversity. The laws that are passed by Congress, our ineffective Congress, are not doing us that much good. And the tax code is terrible. And unless we reform that, I mean, there's got to be some kind of guaranteed minimum income for people, I believe. But I guess I'm a Bernie supporter.
I will throw out that I think you may actually agree strongly with Rabbi Sachs, and I may have quoted him in a way that was unhelpful. But I think he is sort of trying to articulate precisely that. But please go ahead.
Yeah. We were talking about the wealth disparities all over the world. It's just not in the United States or England. Even in Israel, even the most socialistic country, there are still wealth disparities. But in the United States, it's particularly severe because the tax code isn't based on any justice. The tax code is based on influence and lobbying and politics. And until that is modified, we're really never going to have the ability to have a society that is based on equality and not this disparity of resources.
Okay, thank you so much. A couple of other hands are up too, which is great. I think both sides of the room. Excellent.
So we agreed with the Rabbi Sachs quote in theory, and we talked about a lot of things, but we kind of focused on what is justice? Is it what I think or what my friends thought? Is it what the city thinks? Is it what the state? Is it what the United States thinks? There is no singular justice, so there's my justice. There's a community, so there's very many concepts of justice, and there's inequalities and inequities throughout. And that tax code was interesting. We never thought about that, but that's a place to start. But that then is part of the who's the political, what's the law now versus what's the law 20 years ago, 100 years ago. Law is based not just on a singular concept, it's based on what we see, what we think, what we're reacting to today. The tax code doesn't move quite as fast or as much as the law. I will totally agree with you, Michael.
Thank you very much.
I just feel like as a person, it's like it's really confusing. Like you live and you want to have your justice, but it's like there's a conflict of what's really happening. You just have a conflict, what you believe is true and what you really see.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think also there's a hand over here. Yes. We can think as the mic moves.
Thank you.
So expanding on Rabbi Sacks's point, taking it to the fact that nobody ever comes seeking justice from a level playing field. There is inequality across the board. Some are wealthier, some are poorer, some are brighter, better educated, some are less educated, and whatever the issue is, that the parties are not equal. And so it's a question of what is fair and what is equality versus what is the law. Because nobody is equal. Nobody comes from a level playing field.
Thank you. Okay, great. A couple more, and then we'll do our next thing, but this is great. Please go ahead.
The major religions of the world, ours included, are using interpretation and text from many former rabbis or leaders who were certainly dealing with a different population, very small and very limited in their extent of communication with others in a very small part of the world. The global world in which we find ourselves today, virtual or otherwise, is a different structure. And we're wrestling with older texts and how they may or may not apply into our modern considerations.
Thank you. This is great, and will actually in a moment be a really good segue into what we're going to look at next. But before that, we have two more hands in the air, which is wonderful. So please go ahead.
I want to build a little bit on what Larry just said, which is that I think our views of what's just evolve over time. And I was using just an example out of American history where separate but equal was considered just until 1954 when it wasn't just anymore. Well, obviously before, but, the whole concept changed of what was a just way of treating people.
Yeah, thank you very much. I think what you're saying is reminding me of what Lisa was saying about this earlier, and I think it's a really important point for us to pull forward. I think let's take a couple more, and then we'll keep rocking and rolling. Go ahead.
We focused on the last one, which I really like because I think it is sort of affirming or validating that there's lots of ways that you can contribute to a more just world. And it doesn't have to be the giant, grandiose gestures. It can be the small things that nobody sees, or the things that you can fit into your life. I think that's a nice way of thinking about all the ways in which we can all make for a more just world.
Thank you so much. All right. Yeah, there are, I think, Larry and Sam, and
I'll be quick. Two quick points. One is you do need a reference point. So it's good to relatively times change, but you need to have some place to have justice defined, at least that we all say that's a starting point. We disagree, here's why. So one of the great things about what you're doing is this dynamic tension is a really good thing, that there's tension between different definitions of justice. But we also need to know what, at least at one point, we understood justice to be, and then be able to defend why we have a new, we want to veer from that.
For sure, thank you.
Want to send out for dinner now?
So,
Go ahead.
We'll be here for a couple hours.
This is great.
you talking about me? No, thank you. It goes back to, underneath this all are core values, though. You've got to have a starting place. And it occurred to me, we're talking about the mitzvot. What are we obliged to do? For what purpose? And that is a good, in quotes, or Jewish life. And yes, it was written at a time. And so Judaism itself has kept the core mitzvot, as I understand it, and moved to a system for most of the Jews of interpreting it into modernity. But at the same time, I do think there is substantive, choose life.
Right.
Everything has got to come out of that in some part. I mean, at least in my interpretation of Judaism. Then, visit the sick, corner of your fields, so you adapt that. But there has to be justice. That defines justice. Those are definitions of a just or fair or proper world that is, for our faith, truth. Now, they're going to be interpreted and understood and adapted under some systems. And so I think from a reform point of view, we would argue for systems that can implement them and change in light of modernity and understandings. But it requires a studied, not a random or an arbitrary, because some people accuse reform of being, well, whatever you think is good, you can do.
Thank you.
I guess I'd like to suggest that justice may not be, absolute. That part of justice is judgment, and that we have lots of competing values and competing rights. And what's important is the fairness in the judgments that we bring. And maybe it's fair judgments that is justice, and that it changes by circumstance.
Thank you so much. So I think maybe with apologies, because I know there are hands, actually there are a couple hands up. So let's take the hands that are up right now. And then yes. So we'll take one more, and then we'll move to our next text.
I stepped out for a minute, so I hope I'm not repeating something somebody else said. But
it's okay.
I kind of think there's different definitions here, I think, we're talking about of what justice could be. But, equality or justice equality does it mean that everybody should have the same, which is a distribution concept of justice, or does it mean everybody should have the same opportunity to have what everybody else has? And I wonder whether it's, sometimes dangerous to cross the line and say, just give everybody the same. There's issues with that, I think.
No, absolutely.
Maybe I'm a little alone on this, but...
No, I don't think you are at all. I think what you're raising, I think some people use the word equity to describe what you're saying, that it's not just give people the same sort of stuff, but make sure people can have the same access, the same opportunities, and that is a deeper work than equality. I think that I would posit that if we were writing as a group a commentary on this, we might say that those were two of our tzedeks, right? We might, I think that that's a very live conversation in this moment. I was also thinking as I was composing this, I think for the past several decades in our country and in other places in the world, there's been a really rich conversation about the importance of letting people who are most impacted by an issue be the leaders on that, and sort of centering the voices of people who have the most experience with something that we believe needs to be transformed because it's inequitable in our society, set the agenda, and sort of joining in. I I think you can find lots of thoughts in Jewish texts that dovetail really well with that. Like when we think about Jewish texts that celebrate the way people are different from each other, Jewish texts that celebrate sort of lifting up every human being, that argue very strongly against marginalization, stories that sort of bring in marginalized people in their given society as the central and most important character. I think Ruth is a great example of that. So it's not a set of laws, but it's a story that encourages us to look at those values. I didn't bring those to this text sheet, but I would guess that maybe if we were thinking about our time period and we were writing our two justices, we might want to talk about that too. I think there are a lot of, just like many of these people were responding to their own time and place, I think there's a lot of wisdom that our time and place has given us about if our goal is to build a world where people can thrive and be happy and loving and connected. We know some things about methodology in our time that we might want to bring to this too. I think let's have this be the last comment on this for now. Go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to comment briefly on what Joel indicated. And I understand the concept of access to equal resources, but people who don't have been marginalized and they don't have access to equal resources. The people on the bottom, in other words, their kids will not, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. So you've got to be careful on how you view things.
Thank you. Much appreciated. I think let's look at our final page. It's page 5, our final sheet of paper. We're skipping over the middle. If we have time, I'm happy to sort of talk about what the middle is, but to give this a little bit of context, so I wrote my rabbinic thesis about contemporary Jewish rhetorics of resilience in justice work. So I collected mostly sermons, but also text studies and some songs and speeches and some editorials that had been composed between 2016 and early 2022. And looked for patterns in the ways they answered the question, what does it mean to persevere? And how do we persevere when we sort of believe it's our job to work for a better world, but we're not sure quite how to get there? One of the interesting patterns that came forward, which I think was pulled out by a discussion we just had, is that a lot of our, this is really impressive, a lot of our texts that sort of give us direct instructions for how to act in the world, like justice shall you pursue, might not fully meet the needs of our moment. They might not fully sort of help us grapple with challenges, which I think is where a lot of these commentaries are coming from, is that maybe it wasn't meeting the needs of their moment either. Maybe they needed to add things to it as well. But one of the interesting patterns in these sermons, et cetera, as a whole, written in our time period, mostly in America, but also in a few other places, was that most of them told stories. They defaulted to storytelling rather than quotes from law. And the 3 stories they told the most were the story of Noah's Ark, the story of the ancient Israelites while they were slaves in Egypt, and the story of Jews living after the destruction of the Second Temple, and sort of how people grappled with those moments, which were really meaning-making crisis moments for all of those civilizations in different ways. I wanted to invite us to look at a little bit of the discussion around Noah's Ark, because I think it's very provocative. So just to give a gloss, there's a debate in classical Jewish text with which Rashi helpfully summarizes for us. Something that I think is less known about Rashi is that he's very known for writing commentaries on the Bible and the Talmud, where he tried to help people understand the plain meaning of the words. He was also a big scholar of Midrash, and one of his dearest dreams was to help people have more access to Midrash. So whenever there was a Midrash that was related to something in the Torah, he would say, yes, this is related to this Midrash, I'm going to pull it in. Sometimes it's the source of like some of his wackier comments because you don't know what he's drawing from, and it turns out it's a story that someone wrote in the year 300 CE. Here it's cited not by him, but by later scholars are sort of looking for where is he getting these ideas. So he's providing us a helpful summary of some of the Midrashic debates about Noah, but just to sort of gloss them quickly, he is saying the debates go like this. The Torah says that Noah was an ish tzaddik, a righteous person, bidorotav, in his generations. And so the question that gets asked by a lot of later commentators, they're thinking about Noah, who did build an ark and save the animals and his family from the flood, but Noah who let his entire generation drown, right? Noah who let everyone else who was human die. And they say, really? That guy? He was a righteous person? Where are you getting this, right? And so there's an interesting debate that unfolds. Rashi pulls out sort of something from Sanhedrin. This is his second paragraph that starts in his generations, Bidorotav. So some of our rabbis explained in his generations to Noah's credit. They said he was righteous even in his generation. So even surrounded by people who were really harming one another, there's a thought that his generation was a very corrupt one. He was able to be a little more righteous. He was able to do something that allowed life on earth to survive, according to the story. So if he was able to do that, which even though we might judge him and say, why couldn't he do more? If he was able to do that, had he lived in a generation where there was like another ethical person, boy, what a world they would have made together, right? This is one rabbinic argument about Noah. The other is, he says, others explain it to his discredit. In comparison to his own generation, which was very corrupt, he was accounted righteous. But had he lived in the generation of Abraham, and some versions of this make a long, long list of other Jewish figures who they think are better than Noah. They say, had he lived in basically any other generation, he wouldn't have been an important figure. We wouldn't have called him righteous. So there's this debate, were Noah's actions righteous? And I think it's a particularly interesting debate in light of recent scholarship on moral injury, so moral injury is a field of research that started with research into the military and has expanded outward. And the concept of moral injury is the idea that if you either do something that violates your own value system, witness your value system being violated by someone else, like are a bystander to it, or if you are a victim of someone doing something harmful that violates your system of values, that in addition to other painful experiences, so separate from an experience like PTSD, if there was violence involved or whatever else, you may also, military psychologists first said, and then many others sort of agreed in other situations, you may also experience moral injury. You might feel hopeless about your ability to work for change. You might feel less certain of sort of what to do next. And people have applied this in interesting ways. They've looked at the case of medical personnel who weren't able to save everyone they wanted to save because of contingencies that were way outside of their control. And the idea is not necessarily that the person could have done something different, right? But just that they had a value system that in an ideal world they would have. So what does it mean that they didn't? People have looked at what it looks like to be a citizen of a country where you believe that you should be able to effectuate change, but you see your leadership doing things that you think are morally reprehensible and you don't know how to stop them. And sort of, is this a form of moral injury? And so the authors of the story of Noah's Ark definitely were not familiar with this concept, but it is a very interesting story, both in the Torah and in the Midrash, in that it really imagines Noah being sort of traumatized after what happened. And there are also very interesting stories. There's a Midrash I didn't include here, but there's a modern Israeli Midrash that there are two birds in the Noah story. There's the dove, who's very famous, but there's also a raven that gets sent out first. And this Israeli Midrash imagines the dove and the raven as two different paragons of different responses to the Holocaust. And it imagines the raven never coming back because it's flying the earth mourning and sort of mourning all the lost life that it couldn't save. It's just a raven. It wasn't building the ark. And it imagines the dove coming back and sort of very intently deciding to reproduce as soon as possible and sort of make sure there are other doves in the world. And so this story, which is very poignant, is sort of using this to talk about different responses in the Jewish community to the trauma of the Holocaust. It's also, in the language of moral injury, allowing us to imagine the dove and the raven as two different people who moral injury researchers might classify as bystanders. Like the dove and the raven were not in charge of who went on the ark, but they both feel awful about what happened to all of the birds in this story that did not make it onto the ark. And how do you make meaning in the wake of that? How do you move forward? So the Noah's Ark story becomes this really rich area of discussion for this big question of what is righteousness? Was Noah righteous? Is anybody in this story righteous? And sort of if we live through moments like a flood that we feel like we can't stop, whatever those are morally, how do we live ethically in those moments? So I'm going to preview the modern texts that are here and then sort of invite discussion. But so Dina Weiss, who's a scholar at Hadar, which is an observant egalitarian yeshiva in New York City, she writes that she thinks that Noah was called a tzaddik, a righteous person, because basically to encourage us. That his whole life he was sort of teetering on the line of being righteous or not being righteous, and any one decision could have really thrown him into one bucket or the other. But that by noting that he did make a decision that allowed life to survive, and by calling him righteous, the Torah encourages us to think, maybe we could be like that. Like maybe we're not going to be the most righteous person who ever lived, but maybe tomorrow if we have a decision and one option seems better than the other, maybe we can take it. Maybe this is in our reach. So that's her take on Noah. And then on the next page, page 6, Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, also in New York City, an important piece of context for this is coming from a sermon that she's writing on January 8th, 2021, and she's thinking about sort of what it means to be alive in a time of rising white supremacy and hatred in the country, and sort of how do we think about our own actions in life. And she focuses on the ark, which the word for ark in the Bible is teva, and it's only mentioned twice in the Bible. One, it's not the word for boat. Boat is spina. So once is Noah's ark, and the other is the basket that Moses' sister places him into the river. And those are the only two moments when this word comes up in the Bible. And so a lot of people ask sort of what do these things have in common? And Rabbi Kleinbaum says what they have in common is that people who themselves couldn't change the overarching system. Noah, for whatever reason, did not believe he could talk God down the way Abraham would try to later. That's why Rashi is saying maybe Abraham was more just than Noah, because Abraham tried to stop destruction rather than accepting it. Noah believed he couldn't talk God down, and Miriam and the midwives who saved Moses' life, and the Pharaoh's daughter and Miriam's mother, they didn't see a way to undo Pharaoh's decree, which was to kill all of these children. But they did see a way, both Noah and Miriam did see a way to save the next generation in some way. And that was their contribution, is that they put the next generation in a teva, that's what that word means. Rabbi Kleinbaum is saying, based on the continuity, and that sometimes the thing you're called to do in the moment is to think about what's possible to get through to the next generation, to like make it to the next moment when you'll have a little more power than you do right now. And she compares the teva to in the modern day community, something we haven't talked about as much, but I think a really rich resource both in classical Jewish texts and in modern commentary is the idea that community and doing things together is really core to being able to effectuate any change for the better. And she says, maybe that's our arc. So that's another take entirely, right? And then finally, Rabbi Michael Marmer, writing in Jerusalem, he focuses on, he sort of starts with a kind of funny thing, which is that the name for a return ticket in Israel, at least when he moved there, was halok vashov, which comes from the Noah story. And it's the word that's used for the waves that eventually retreat from the earth and eventually make way for land. And he says, no, we have this all wrong. We're not the birds in the Noah story. We're not Noah. We're not Noah's kids. We're not the ark. We're the waves. We're the waves that destroyed the world, and we have to now figure out how to pull back. Like, that's our job. We should see ourselves not as bystanders, but as perpetrators. So he sort of throws out another take on the Noah story and how we should think about it and what it means for us. And there were others as well, but I think this is a good sampling of some of the ways people seem to have been thinking about this story in the last half decade or so in particular in our world. And I guess I'd throw out now, having sort of said all of that, how does it sit with you? Do you think that Noah is a righteous person based on this story? Why or why not? Who do you think we should compare ourselves to in this story, if anyone? Where does it land for you? Please go ahead.
There is a third arc, and that was the one that Martin Luther King Jr. told us about. And I brought it up.
Please.
The arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. Change takes a long time, but it does happen. So yeah, I can see that with Noah and that arc. That was a change towards, it was a do-over towards justice.
Thank you. That's very powerful. Thank you for sharing that.
I'll just say it just begs the question of what does God have to do with it? Because the story suggests that some of these people have had a unique ability. In the word, it says God, so this being, maybe the other thing is that some people have they're prophets of our time that have an insight and ability, sometimes even beyond their own control, to do the, quote, right thing.
Thank you so much. I think also what your comment is pulling out for me is I think there's a tension in Jewish thought between the God of Torah, who is a character who often does really capricious and harmful things, and then sort of the God that Jewish thinkers agreed upon over time, who was a very Neoplatonic God who stood for kind of ideals of righteousness and truth and justice. And those gods don't always fit into the same sentence very comfortably, and I think the Noah story, if we want to engage with the idea of God in Noah, it becomes very complicated very quickly, sort of what do we mean by that and why. Sorry, that was a tangent off of what you said, but I appreciate what you said.
But it might be that's how Torah dealt with. That might be how Torah dealt with inspired people. I don't know the right word for it.
For sure.
But there are people, Martin Luther King, he heard something inside of him that he wasn't a perfect human being, we know that, but was moved and he couldn't help himself. That's my belief, that people, I've been privileged to know a couple of those people, some of them do crazy things, but when I see them up close, they can't see the world any different way than how they see it. And it's not that I believe they've got a direct line. It's much as there's some people that's part of how the universe works.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Any other thoughts on this question? Was Noah or anyone in this story righteous? Why or why not?
I'd like to say a word on behalf of God here.
Please.
There's maybe the concept the concept of what God is or who God is changes a lot. but it's at least a common thread that gives us the structure to consider people's actions, to consider, did they hear the divine spark, or did they, you know, the eternal, not one maybe, but the eternal, I don't want to use the word truth like it's an absolute, but yeah, there is an eternal truth that's an absolute. We just don't know it, you know, or whatever. So we just have to be a little nicer to this guy because, you know, he's lasted a long time.
Thanks. I think maybe what I'll do quickly, because we have a couple more minutes, is just preview, if you want to look at on your own, the resources on 3 and 4. So just to give a sense of, so pages 3 onward, including the Noah story, are sort of sparked off of this quote from Pirkei Avot, which is probably like circa 200 CE and maybe a little bit earlier, which collects different wisdom sayings of early rabbis. And one of them is this saying that's become very famous in our time, I think. It's not up to you to finish the work, but neither are you free to desist from it. Actually continues on. If you have studied much Torah, you will be given much reward. Faithful is your employer, i.e. God potentially, to pay you the reward of your labor, and know that the grant, reward, the word he's using for reward more literally means salary. So we might call it that. And know that the grant of salary onto the righteous is in the future to come. So this interesting metaphor about and there's a commentary that's not in here where somebody says, and this I think also goes to our discussion of God, they say it's as though you were hired to dig a hole. The person hiring you in this classical commentary is God, and you see that you alone are not going to be able to dig the hole. You should not go back to your employer and say, what were you thinking? I'm not going to be able to dig the hole. Why did you hire me for this? You should assume that maybe your employer hired someone else to come tomorrow, but today this is what you're going to do. And so this is this metaphor that's being used in classical commentaries. One of the things that interested me is, as compared to some of our other big sort of like justice quotes that get used a lot in the 21st and also 20th centuries, this one, which I think is a very popular one, there are lots of songs based on it, does not have much commentary beyond the whole story in sort of our classical texts. And I don't know if that's because it seemed self-evident to people, like they didn't have as much they wanted to debate with, or for some other reason we could speculate on. But it does raise these interesting questions, right? How do we balance knowing that it's not up to us to finish all the work, but we shouldn't give up? Like, how do we hold both of those things and make sure we're not kind of slacking off, but also not pushing ourselves in a way that is harmful when something is going to extend beyond our lifetime? And also, Rabbi Tarfon in Pirkei Avot, he really believed, and know that the salary of the righteous is going to come in the future. So know that your reward is going to pay off. And I think there's this real question and debate in Jewish thought, which we don't have time for tonight, but we could sort of throw it into the air, which is, do you need to hope for a specific future in order to be engaged in work for a better future? Like, do you need to have a real active belief that your actions are going to result in that better future coming? If so, how can you cultivate that? If not, what does it mean to sort of work for that future anyway? How do you hold both of those things? And so the stories here, which feel free to look at another time if you're interested, but there are 2 stories from the Talmud that are parables. They both take place with people who are living in the time of the temple's destruction. The first one is about people thrown out to sea, but maybe also about people living through times of great disruption based on sort of who the people are. These are 3 generations of people who lived before, during, and after the destruction of the temple. Another story about sort of like hope after the temple was destroyed, and then a modern response to What Is It by Rabbi Jill Perlman, who argues that the paradigm of teshuvah, tefillah, tzedakah, which we use a lot on the high holidays, so when we often translate it as repentance, prayer, and charity, temper, judgment, severe decree, it's a good rhyme. She translates it a little differently, but she uses it as an approach. So feel free to look at those sort of at your leisure. We have 5 minutes left, so I think what I'll do is I'll invite you to turn back to the folks you were discussing with before, and maybe just to talk about what is one thing that it's not up to you to finish the work, but neither are you free to desist from it? What is one thing that means to you? Sort of how do you actualize that? Or do you reject the premise, which is also fine? But go ahead, turn to the person you were chatting with for just like a moment or two, and then we'll close out our time together. I'm glad. This was fun for me. I hope for others too. Here, I'll.
When you're ready, thank you.
Okay. I'm gonna quickly invite you to pause. I apologize. There's not time now for sharing back. However, there's plenty of time in our lives for chatting with each other. So if you had a brilliant idea that you want to share, feel free to grab anyone and everyone as we leave and tell us. But I'll just say thank you so much for this really wonderful conversation. I really appreciated it. Look forward to continuing it with you all. And we'll turn the floor back over. Thank you so much.
I don't know whether we've resolved the question of whether there is objective truth or justice, but one thing I hope we can all agree on, we have been the beneficiaries of excellent teaching and a very stimulating and enlightening discussion. So thank you, Rabbi Stein, for that. And thank you all of those of you who participated, both verbally and by thinking about what you heard and moving from the place where you came in to a new place that may have acknowledged something that you hadn't been thinking before. It's a journey that we've all taken together, and what a wonderful thing to be fellow travelers tonight. So please be sure to join us next Thursday for the final presentation of this Summer Limmud series. Cantor Shockett will speak about ethics in the workplace. Where have we heard that is needed? I'm sure we'll all have some good stories to share. And by the way, you may have noticed that the rain has stopped. I think that means the dove has returned. So please grab your drinks and your snacks, and we'll go out onto the terrace to share and to have a little nosh and to chew over what we've heard and to look forward to next week and enjoy some friendship. Thank you.